I'm a macro portfolio strategist, so I cover multiple assets, but energy is important. And I actually started out as an energy analyst and as an equity analyst. So I've always had a interest in the sector. And just recently, because of what's going on in the Middle East, I've been paying a lot of attention to sort of the geopolitical risk factor for oil prices. And I've been saying that, the market isn't pricing in enough risk of a major war in the Middle East. And so that's one of the main themes that I've been talking about at some of the podcasts in my own YouTube channel. So that's something I'm prepared to talk about in a lot more depth and detail than probably, that you'll
because
normally hear.
I'm just going to sit here the whole time we talk about this and go, at the beginning of my career, a bomb went off, oil went up $10.
Right.
And that's not happening. It's like, well, what happened?
Sure.
And
then of course, if, I'm also, so I'll probably talk a lot about that, but obviously there's other issues right now going on, which, that are sort of subsidiary to that whole thing about, let's say OPEC and what prospects, a lot of the major banks are coming out with their 2025 outlooks. So, you might be interested in touching on that, what my thoughts are.
Do the opposite of whatever I say. That's the one thing we learned. Anytime we were discussing hedging at a portfolio company around the table, what does Yates say? Let's do the opposite. So real quick, what's your company? What does your company do? How does it make money?
Okay. So my company is Investor Acumen, and we are an independent research provider. So I provide research and consulting services to institutions mainly, but I also have a couple of businesses that are oriented towards individual investors, where we have some model portfolios to help individual investors, sort of structure their portfolios.
So I'm a hedge fund. I'll pay you X dollars per year or whatever it is to get a hold of your research.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
That's exactly what it is.
Got it.
So it's sort of, they'll either pay for just my research, or if it comes along with a consulting service, there's an arrangement where, they're able to call me up and we talk a certain number of hours, or they have a certain amount of access.
Right. Yeah. The hedge fund guys like to talk. I don't think they actually read stuff when you send it to them, or at least that was always kind of my experience.
That's very true.
What'd you say in this piece? Yeah,
exactly.
They
just want the summary. They want to just get to the bottom line and kind of get into the, to the questions and the nitty gritty.
So where do we level set to kind of start this? Do we level set it with, there's no geopolitical risk in the price of oil today, and boom, you launch? Or how do we?
Yeah, maybe that might be a good way. You just suggested something, interesting observation. Oil is relatively close to its 52-week low. The price of crude oil, and despite the fact that there's a potential for a major war in the Middle East, and that seems a little unusual, and markets don't seem to be discounting that risk. And so, I brought somebody on the show that, has been writing about this, and thought we'd, talk to him in depth about the risk of a war in the Middle East, since the market seems to be disregarding that risk.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I was about to say, just fire away on that. I actually, my 2 cents worth is what we've been talking about would be interesting just if we showed and start. I think people kind of like the more realistic, authentic stuff.
Sure.
As opposed to a T-ball question. But history of my career in the oil and gas business, a bomb went off in the Middle East and oil jumped $10, and it felt like the world would stop, or unfortunately, you in the United States owning assets would go, wow, I'm rich, or whatever. So what's going on today? Why are we not seeing that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, when we were growing up and when we first came into the industry, we were in a sense just coming out of the 80s and the late 70s, where the oil industry had experienced several major shocks. And so there's still a lot of nervousness in financial markets because people had memories of devastating oil price shocks. So anytime there was any sort of news coming out of the Middle East or something that might disrupt the supply of oil, people were thinking back to 73, 74, thinking back to 79 with the Iranian Revolution. Basically all those memories were like, oh my God, here we go again. The landscape in the oil and gas industry has changed dramatically, as you know, from every point of view, not just geopolitically, but also just in terms of, supply, demand for oil, the place that the United States is in terms of major oil supplier. Back in the 70s, the United States was becoming more and more dependent on foreign oil. Therefore, the sourcing was in a sense more risky and more exposed to risk in the Middle East. So there's so many things that have changed now. And I think that people have forgotten about the risks, the types of things that happened back in the 70s and the 80s haven't happened in such a long time. In fact, probably most oil traders today and people that are involved in the industry never experienced those events at all. They may not even have memories of that in their childhood.
Right.
And so I think that psychological backdrop helps explain a little bit why people seem to not be taking very seriously some potentially devastating things that could be happening in the Middle East that could really disrupt global oil supplies. I think that there's also just a lot of blind spots right now about different trends that are happening in the Middle East, because this is something that, again, people haven't had to pay attention to in a very long time, particularly, and this is just overall people, but even people in the industry, I think, haven't really been paying attention to some real major changes in politics and society and demographics in the Middle East, Israel. And so I think this situation of a potential war, for example, between Israel and Iran is something that's sort of sneaking up on us because people aren't really paying attention to it and therefore not taking it seriously.
Yeah, let's break this down. So I have theories on this, so I'll throw them at you. And Chuck, that's really stupid is a totally appropriate answer. So one, it feels like the infrastructure to deliver oil today versus the 70s, way more complicated, way more advanced. And we've gotten to the point where if we embargo someone, that just means the ship goes to a different port. I mean, it's so built out that it really is hard to stop a barrel. Is that part of this?
I think so, yes. I mean, certainly it's harder to create a supply disruption today. And also, we have to understand that, the inventory management is really different, right? We also have the strategic reserve, which wasn't around back in the early 70s, for example, when the Arab oil embargo happened. So there's just and as you said, with logistics and with the ability to coordinate, for example, the landing point that ships are at sea and, almost immediately change and reroute them to different places. All these things have meant that minor disruptions really won't cause a very major problem. But, for example, one of the things that I've been talking about is that there is a very serious problem when it comes to the Persian Gulf, because through the Strait of Hormuz, you got about 20% of global oil supply that actually flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So in the event of a war between Iran and Israel, if Iran were to decide to try to block the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, which is something that we'll kind of discuss because I think that's the real risk here, then there's going to be no way to sort of make up for 20% of the world's oil supply that actually comes through the Strait of Hormuz. There's really no way around that. And as you know,
so who comes out of the Strait of Hormuz? Iranian oil, Iraqi oil,
Saudi, Kuwaiti,
okay,
UAE, Iraqi oil. Pretty much the entire Gulf region, the vast majority of their oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz.
And so the war. I always hate the fact that we traffic in misery in our business, but it just is a fact. I mean, we have to deal with this. So the war that happens is shooting bombs across each other and just tankers aren't there? Or is it basically the terrorist offshoot of the war that are taking tankers out? What actually happens war-wise to stop the flow of the tankers out of there.
Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, the main issue here is whether or not Iran would make a decision to try to actually disrupt the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay.
My contention is that they will ultimately do this because this is the only way they can save themselves. If they find themselves in a situation where there's actually an all-out war with Israel, they'll also be essentially in an all-out war against the United States.
Right.
They have very low probability of survival. The regime probably won't survive. At that point, the only cards that they hold are essentially to try to blackmail the global economy. And the way that they can do that is by shutting all commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices would rise to $300-$400. It would cause devastating recessions, inflation around the world. The entire world would be very anxious to bring a very, very quick end to the war. And therefore, the Iranians know that the entire world is going to be wanting to get Israel off their back, get the United States off the back to end the war as soon as possible to end the devastating recession. So I think that's the card that they would pull in the event that a war broke out, because the alternative for them is to lose and to have a regime change there. Now, how would they go about doing that? Because that's another big question a lot of people have. Well, you have the U.S. Navy, protecting the Strait of Hormuz. How can they?
It's a core competency of the Iranians to blow things up. They're actually really good at that. But keep going on this. So
yeah, I mean, they've been preparing for a scenario like this for something like 20 years. Their entire armed forces is essentially geared towards the possibility of blocking the Strait of Hormuz. So they very much prepared for this scenario. And one way that we know that they really are capable of doing this, because there's a lot of people who are very skeptical about their ability to actually do it. But today we shouldn't have any real doubt about it, because all we have to do is look at what the Houthis of Yemen are doing in the Red Sea. The Houthis of Yemen today, having not even 1% of the military and economic resources of the Iranians, have managed to block something like 75% of all traffic that flows through the Red Sea. They've had to reroute it, and which is, obviously increased transportation costs and so forth. How did they do this? They simply announced to the entire world, said, any shipping that comes through here, we're gonna sink your ship. So what happens? Commercial insurers won't insure the ships. The owners of the ships are going to put their crews at risk and their ships at risk, particularly if they're not insured. So they just won't go through there. That's essentially all the Iranians will have to do. The Iranians, if they simply announce that any ship that comes through the Strait of Hormuz will be sunk, there'll be no insurance, no commercial shipper will dare to go through there. In addition to the fact that they actually have the military capacity because again, they have they're right there on the Strait of Hormuz. They have a huge landmass that they can launch missiles, and we've seen that they have very sophisticated missile technology at any ship and basically overwhelm the defense. In fact, I mean, they can certainly overwhelm the defenses of any commercial vessel, and there's no way that the U.S. Navy can actually protect those commercial vessels. There's actually major questions today whether U.S. naval vessels can protect themselves against the Iranians. There's a lot of military experts that believe that U.S. warships today are essentially sitting ducks against some of the highest technology missile systems that the Iranians have been able to develop, particularly the hypersonic missiles.
So, quick side note, not to derail us, but when blowing up Nord Stream first happened, I thought it was the Iranians. Mm-hmm. I thought that was kind of their, it's their core competency, blowing stuff up. I thought there was a path to get Iranian gas into Europe, so there was actually an economics incentive to do it. I don't guess the Iranians did that, but I guess it's still an unknown question. Do you still believe what you just said about the Iranians and their sophistication, given what we've seen with the missile launches onto Israel? Because that's kind of looked Keystone Cops. I mean, I hate to phrase it that way. But
sure. Well, I think, yes, in terms of their more low-tech drones, for example, those are easy to shoot out. And some of their older model, let's say, missiles that, are using like 20-year-old technology. But they actually, one of the things that they were able to prove is that in their second attack, they went after a couple of Israeli military installations, particularly an Air Force base, and they were actually able to get their hypersonic missiles through the Iron Dome. And so that's interesting because the Israelis are protected by the most sophisticated anti-air technology in the world, and yet they weren't really fully able to prevent the most sophisticated Iranian missiles from striking their targets. So since the Strait of Hormuz and the shipping there isn't protected by any kind of an Iron Dome, we can know for sure that they'll be able to hit any sort of shipping that they have there. And in fact, and also because they're just a lot closer. I mean, it's just right there. And they can just overwhelm because it's also kind of a numbers game. Not only do they have like some very sophisticated missiles, but they just have an overwhelming amount of production. And so there is no, let's say, missile defense system that can defend against hundreds of missiles coming at a ship simultaneously. Again, there's even a lot of concern on the part of the U.S. that if Iran actually decided to take out one of the U.S.'s aircraft carriers, that it could actually do it, that U.S. defenses are insufficient to actually defend against a full Iranian assault with their missiles. But there's no question that commercial shipping, they're just sitting ducks. So even if one had some doubts about the ability of the Iranians, for example, to defeat the U.S. Navy or to be able to strike key targets within Israel, there's very little doubt that they have the technology to take out commercial shipping. And that's really the key, because a lot of people say, well, there's no way that the Iranians can take on the U.S. Navy. Well, they don't have to take on the U.S. Navy. They're taking on commercial vessels. They just have to tell the commercial vessels, if you go through that, we'll shoot at you.
Right.
And so it's that's why it's referred to as sort of asymmetric warfare. The Iranians aren't going to go directly and have big naval battles with the U.S. Navy. They're just going to go after the weakest link in the chain, which are these commercial vessels that are essentially defenseless.
Yeah, because I mean, now that you say that, I mean, if you own a commercial vessel, I mean, that's your livelihood, and,
of course,
and it's very expensive and all that.
Yeah, you're not
even if the U.S. Navy's saying, "No, I got you," I'm still like, "No, we're good.
No,
I'm gonna be over in the Mediterranean."
Yeah. Absolutely, no. Nobody's going to be taking the risk of saying, "Oh, the U.S. Navy is going to be able to protect my ship against an onslaught of incoming missiles."
Right.
I mean, because again, a capital, the owners of these ships would be risking their capital, they'd be risking their crews, and they can't even get insurance for it.
Right.
So it's a no-go. It's a complete no-brainer. The traffic will completely stop. And that's what's interesting. A lot of people think, oh, well, the Iranians will have to do this, that, and the other. They literally don't have to do anything. All they have to do is just announce, and just with words, and it'll stop all the traffic.
Yeah, no, that's so how does this play into it? If I'm the West, if I'm the United States, and I said this 12 years ago at a conference, so I've still got 3 years left to be right. They said, give us a take. And I said, within 15 years, there's going to be a regime change in Iran, and they will be our strongest ally in the Middle East. Because, I mean, generally speaking, I think the take is of the Iranian people, not the regime. They're pretty pro-West, more plastic surgery than any other country on the planet,
Yeah.
I mean, and so, the struggle we have, the United States working with Israel on this, is we can damage Iraq by blowing up their oil infrastructure, their nuke infrastructure, all that. But then if the regime topples, how do they have a life that's not, how do they have an economy of any sort? We've got to balance that, because if they don't have a functioning economy, you probably get a worse regime at some point.
Well, in theory, if they had a good regime, both the United States and Israel would probably help them rebuild and try to do so relatively quickly. And I think that, there's the sense is that there's a lot of support potentially in Iran. Iranians understand that in order to overthrow the current regime, it'll be a civil war. It'll be a very violent affair. So, and that's actually part of the problem, really, because, really the answer, to your question that you pose, that you mentioned that you were at a conference 12 years ago, and the question of regime change, I think the interesting issue there is that the Iranians several years ago realized that they were weak, that the popularity of their regime was collapsing, that the attitudes and the culture in Iran was changing, and that they realized that this was a threat to the Islamic regime. This actually happened in one of their key elections where the people actually voted for the candidate that wasn't supported by the Ayatollah. And at that point, they actually felt that they were losing control of the population. Now, one of the things that's actually happening in Iran today, which you've probably heard of, is that the population is massively moving away, religiously speaking, from the Islamic religion as promoted by the current regime. Massive numbers of mosques in Iran have been shutting down because nobody's attending. There's even actually a fairly significant sort of underground Christian revival that's going on there, although most of the people that are abandoning Islam in Iran are simply becoming agnostics and atheists. So there's a definite, there's a lot of cultural change happening in the general population. But on the other hand, there's something else that's, in a sense, even more important, which is that the Iranian clerical regime has a tighter grip on the security apparatus through the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, than they've ever had before. The Iranians have developed a very detailed and sophisticated sort of ideological indoctrination program for the IRGC. It's estimated that something like 50% of the training of any IRGC officer is actually ideological training. And by ideological training, this just means convincing them that, for example, the words and the will of the supreme leader is the most important and most paramount thing, and that loyalty to the supreme leader is unquestioned. The IRGC, we have to understand, isn't the regular Iranian army. It's an army that's loyal to the revolution, not to Iran. It's actually a separate branch. It works a little bit like the SS stormtroopers did in Nazi Germany that were loyal to the Führer, but actually had a completely separate organization from the rest of the German army. That's how the IRGC operates. And they control, they're basically the internal police. There's also an external arm to the IRGC, but they control the internal police, and they actually have a tighter grip on that security apparatus and than they ever have before. And of course, they control the means of violence. So from the point of view of the general Iranian population, the culture is moving away from the regime, but the grip that the regime has on the population from the point of view of just the security apparatus and the apparatus of the state overall is greater than it's ever been. One of the things that's actually happened is that the IRGC has actually been given control of several key industries in Iran. So they have a huge amount of money, and there's huge economic interests that are not allied with the IRGC. So sort of running against the trend or the tendency that you point out is this other internal tendency and trend towards greater control and also a greater radicalization of the support structure that the regime relies on. In other words, the types of people that support the regime today, both the clergy and the army or the armed forces, are more religiously radicalized today than they ever have been. And so for them, they believe in a series of doctrines. For example, I recently had a talk where I was talking about the rise of Mahdiism within Iran, but particularly between within the clergy and in the military. And Mahdiism, as it is currently sort of emerging in Iran, it has a lot of different strains to it. But one of the main strains that's emerging is the belief that in order to pave the way for the Mahdi, which is essentially the Messiah from their point of view, that conditions have to be made right to prepare the way for the Mahdi's return. And it's believed that there has to be a major global conflagration and a major war against the forces of evil in the world that'll actually catalyze the return of the Mahdi. And so a lot of people in the Iranian regime and the IRGC particularly believe that a precondition for the return of the Mahdi is actually a war, a major war with Israel as the great, evil in the world. And I only bring that up because these are things that I think are a blind spot for the West. We don't know that these things are going on, that these very radical tendencies are happening within Iran. I'll give you another example of how significant this is. The supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, several years ago declared that it was a state objective for Iran to bring about the elimination of the state of Israel in 2040. When this happened many years ago, it alarmed people, but people say, oh, that's just talk, that's just, a guy just saying stuff. But actually, Iran actually has put in place a serious policies to try to carry out this essentially this edict, because one of the things that's actually happened within Iran is that they've developed a doctrine of infallibility with regards to the statements of their supreme leader. This is actually something that didn't previously exist within Iran and in their Shia religion, but they've actually developed this doctrine of infallibility. It's a little bit similar to what happened in terms of the Catholic Church and the statements of the Pope. There's actually a plan in place. And in fact, one of the things that people in the West don't know is that there's actually a public park in Tehran. And it is actually, and there's a clock there. And the clock is counting down to 2040, the date of the destruction of the state of Israel. It's called Palestine Square. So this is a state, explicit state policy to bring about the elimination of the state of Israel by 2040. It's something that's widely known, understood, advertised within Iran. It's guiding their policy, but we in the West are sort of blind to it. It's actually quite remarkable that we don't actually understand that this is going on. But certainly the Israelis have been paying attention to these trends, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But this is actually one of the main things that's actually motivating Israeli policy towards Iran, because they see that the Iranians are actually serious about trying to eliminate them by 2040. And so this has caused a major shift in terms of Israeli thinking about how they have to handle Iran.
So that's fascinating, because it feels like there's a public uprising every so often in Iran, and you kind of sit there and go, okay, this time's it. Just given what limited information I have as a degenerate alcoholic who sits around and doesn't read much about Middle East stuff, and it seems like the uprising gets quelled, and
absolutely,
and it goes away. And so they've actually
just recently, there's been a huge increase in the number of public executions by public hanging of dissidents. But we're talking about minor acts of dissidents in Iran are being punished by death, and people are being hung up by cranes. And there's been recently a major increase in that, because obviously the regime feels a little bit more threatened right now at the possibility of an uprising. And as you know, Israel has basically stated that it's their policy right now to seek regime change in Iran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has already had two public addresses where he has specifically directed his speech at the Iranian people, speaking directly to the Iranian people, saying, we are the friends of the Persian people. We love the Persian people. We have historically been allies. We've been friends. We have no qualms. We have no issue with the Persian people. But we have a problem with your regime that's threatening us and that's also oppressing you. Essentially calling for the Iranian people to organize a revolt and a civil war. The Iranians understand what's up. They understand that they are going to have some internal issues, and they're trying to shore up and basically terrorize their population and say, hey, don't even think about it, or else you're going to end up here on one of these cranes.
So on a scale of one being no way in hell, let's call it and then 10 being a moral certainty actually will happen, What's kind of the range on the shot that there will be a regime change, if you had to kind of handicap it along those lines? Because I'm me listening to you going, man, there's no way in hell this isn't going to happen.
I don't think it'll happen unless there's actually a war, an all-out war that so weakens the regime that it actually gives rise to, or it gives a space and a possibility for internal opposition within Iran to try to take over. And it would actually have to be supported by the United States and Israel with funds, weapons, and so forth. Because again, internally, in the end, the majority of the population can hate the Iranian regime and the IRGC, but they have all the guns and they have the weapons and they have the whole apparatus of the state.
Well, and the regime, are they, hey, so long as you don't mess with us politically, you can go have your plastic surgery and party if you want on the weekend? Is there some kind of semblance of freedom given to the people where, at the end of the day, if I can go home, get a Bud Light, watch a little bit of TV, am I going to really revolt and go to war? Or do they push it hard enough that there is a possibility that there's an uprising?
Well, yeah, that's a great point. I mean, they're trying to straddle a line between not making the population feel that it's overly oppressed, but at the same time, kind of always reminding them who's the boss. So you've probably seen in the news that just, in fairly recent times, the Iranians have resumed a crackdown on the use of the Islamic headscarf, and women being arrested, beaten, and certainly anybody that openly, let's say, protests or openly speaks out against the edicts of the state are being imprisoned and they're being hung up. So I think that the way I would describe what's happening right now is that as long as people stay quiet and don't openly, let's say, challenge the regime, they're being left alone. But anybody who is seen or perceived to be openly challenging the legitimacy and the authority of the regime, they're cracking down really hard on that. And so to the point where even not wearing the hijab in public is being seen as a sign of rebellion, and therefore, these folks are being arrested and in some cases actually, hung up.
Interesting. So, I think the other thing that the market is missing, and this is, I think, just a bunch of generalists who look at energy, is the shale revolution was pretty amazing in the United States. I mean, we had Hubble's peak and whatever it was, 1970, 72, and we hit 10 million barrels a day, and we fell to, call it 5. And then we went from 5 to where we are today at 13. Yeah. I mean, pretty amazing that we can do that. I do think we have an issue with inventory. I mean, there's only so much more of this rock we can keep doing. Now, that being said, I've been saying this for 7 years and I've been totally wrong.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it feels like the market's saying, oh, well, if we can't have it in the Middle East, we'll just drill for it here. And one, we have the inventory to do it. And then number two, they have no concept that you can't just refine sweet, light, sweet crude here in the United States. So is that part of the reason we're not seeing?
Absolutely. That's led to a lot of overconfidence. There's this idea that, hey, the United States, if there's any kind of a shortfall, we can produce the oil here. And that's basically been true with respect to, relatively minor increases in the supply. But when you're talking about 20% of global oil supply, 20 million barrels per day, the U.S. industry doesn't have the capacity to turn that switch on. I mean, in an absolute extreme situation, the U.S. might be able to increase production, for example, within a 12-month period of time. I imagine that, with really high oil prices, let's say, $200 oil prices, you could probably add, 1.5 million maybe barrels a day, using, spare capacity that we have in terms of drilling rigs and so forth. and bringing online, sort of older properties that weren't profitable at lower prices and so forth. But, that's 1.5 million barrels, compared to 20 million. So but that's like you said, there's a certain complacency that's been built into the market, and the market is simply not aware that 20 million barrels could actually go offline. It's just simply not in anybody's sort of calculation today that's even a remote possibility. But it is.
Well, and there's another thing to it that I used to get mocked at Kane Anderson when I'd bring this up, but I think this is the way you have to look at the world sometimes, particularly when you're an investor. My dad's a doctor, and people come to Dad and go, well, what are my chances of surviving this? And my dad used to always say, it's either 100 or 0. You either will or you won't,
Yeah.
And his point was actually a bigger one is,
Sure.
hey, you fight every day because we cure diseases that were incurable. And one day, boom, we figure it out and you can live. And so you just fight for every day and try to make it 100%. But my whole point is, like, this is very binary. I mean, either 20 million barrels comes off the market or it doesn't. It's not like, oh, well, there's a 35% chance this happens, so maybe it's 7 million barrels. No, it's either going to be 20 or it's going to be 0. I think you're right on that.
Yeah. But then that's the interesting thing as investors, the way to handle this is that you have to do an expected return calculation, right? In other words, you say, okay, what happens in the event that there is a war and the supply of oil is disrupted? To what price would oil rise in that sort of scenario? And then you apply, okay, what's the probability that that'll happen? And for example, if you think that there was even only just a 20% or a 30% chance it would happen, in other words, less than 50, that would still justify a very high premium in oil prices right now, particularly at the longer end of the curve. And so where you really see the complacency is that that's not at all being priced in. In other words, that essentially, if you sort of infer the probability that the market is assigning to a major oil disruption, it's got to be very near 0. And that's where I think there's actually an interesting opportunity now, because the risk is, or the opportunity relative to the risk is absolutely asymmetric. Because if this type of thing happens, we're looking at oil in $300-$400 range and above. Let me give you an example, because people can be a little skeptical about this. But during the Arab oil embargo of 1973, 1974, the disruption in global oil supply was, depending on what estimate you're looking at, somewhere between in the neighborhood about 5%. Some people estimate a little bit more, some a little less, but we'll just call it in the middle, somewhere about 5% for about 3 months. That caused a quadrupling in the price of oil at that particular point in time. Why? Everybody in the oil industry understands this, is that the demand for oil is inelastic. It's completely inelastic. So
in my whole career, it goes up 1 million barrels a day per year. I mean, that's just what it does, right?
Yeah.
Maybe 1.5 million sometimes.
Yeah.
I think.
And so the thing is,
take COVID out. I think once, maybe during the economic crisis, like 2008 or 2009, it was down 800,000 barrels a day.
Yeah. Yeah. And we saw during, right before the 2008, 2009, how prices absolutely skyrocketed. Once demand exceeded supply, even by 500,000 barrels, prices, doubled at that particular point in time. So we're talking about the potential of a disruption in oil supplies today as a result of what's going on in Iran, between Iran and Israel, that's even greater, much greater than the disruption that actually happened during the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Much greater. We're talking about the difference between disruption in oil supply of roughly 5% versus about 20% here. Much greater than the disruption that happened during the Iranian Revolution that caused oil prices to, shoot up and double during the 80s and caused all the economic devastation that it did here in the United States and around the world. Again, none of that's being priced in. And that's not to say that that's certain. I'm not saying, and nobody can claim, because nobody knows that for sure there's going to be a war and this is going to happen. But the markets are going to be caught completely asleep and completely off guard, because there's not even a risk premium that's currently being built in here. And again, that's where I think that the risks and rewards are sort of very asymmetric right now in the market.
So, and we'll give all the disclaimers of, this is not intended to be investment advice, blah, 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 blah. But if you're an investor, how do you potentially play this? Is this a bucket of majors and I wind up taking my dividends? Do I go out on the NYMEX, play commodities? What are some thoughts there?
I mean, there's a lot of things that, different people can do depending on what types of risks they're willing to take. I mean, one of the easy things about this right now is that if you look at the oil and gas sector, and particularly the E&P sector, it's the most, first of all, in historical terms, the sector is very cheap and looks very attractive just on absolute terms. But on relative terms, relative to the rest of the S&P 500, the oil and gas industry, and particularly E&P, is trading at its lowest relative valuations to the market than it has almost at any other time in history. So right now, what you have here is a situation where you have very relatively limited downside, okay, because of the relative valuation, because of the absolute valuation, but you have essentially a built-in call option that you're getting for free, that if there is some sort of major disruption in global oil supply that the industry would benefit from by owning E&P producers that are trading at very low multiples right now to earnings, to cash flow, to their assets, then it's, very much a very asymmetric profile, which is really what a person really looks for in investment. You want to look for something that has relatively low upside and has a lot of upside. That's kind of the profile right now that you see with E&P. Now, there's other ways, more aggressive ways to play this in the options markets, through using options on producers or just directly in the commodities markets and the futures market.
Yeah, it's interesting. We used to start every investor committee meeting when we'd look at something. I'd always start with, okay, what do we know that the market doesn't know? That's always something I need, because at the end of the day, consensus leads to, average returns if you're thinking alike. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. You taught me a lot of stuff today about Iran that I didn't appreciate, that they're literally 2040. I mean, the destruction of Israel. Yeah. So this isn't a skirmish that potentially goes away. This also doesn't sound like something Jared Kushner could go in and create an agreement in 6 months.
No.
Have you heard this too? I've heard that the success he had with the Abraham Accords was literally because with MBS, he sat there and played Call of Duty.
I mean, I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah, they sat there for hours and they would play Call of Duty. And when they were in different cities, they would play Call of Duty and stuff. It sounds like this isn't getting solved by that.
Yeah. And, there's so many aspects to this. And, maybe I'll just go off on a little bit of a tangent here, and you can tell me if you're interested or not. But because I think that's what's interesting about this situation. You just brought up something right now. It's a very important, all of us as investors, we're taught from the time we're young to ask yourself that question. What is it that that isn't being reflected in the price?
Right.
And what I find interesting is in this situation right now, that there's a lot of things that energy investors should know, but really don't know. And are not paying attention to, which is very unusual because the reality is the market is actually usually pretty efficient. And there's a lot of extremely smart, capable people in this industry and every industry, that deals in financial markets. And so that's where I think that's so interesting that we have some blind spots going on. So, I mentioned this, the fact that it's essentially state policy in Iran to destroy Israel by 2040. Now, the interesting thing is how are the Israelis responding to this? Because this is the other part of the equation. In order for us to understand the probability of a war breaking out, we need to understand how Israel is thinking about this. Because one of the things that I want to make clear is that from the Iranian point of view, they have a long-term strategic plan to destroy Israel. Their plan isn't to destroy Israel in a major war. Their plan is to bleed Israel out over the long run. So their strategy is essentially a strategy where they will ideologically train, where they will arm with technology and armaments, that they'll train the forces of various proxy forces and finance various proxy forces that surround Israel. This is Iran's sort of strategy of destroying Israel by 2040, and to take on Israel through asymmetric warfare, which involves both the launching of various types of missiles into Israel and also cross-border, like sort of terrorist attacks, kind of like the one that you saw on October 6th. This is all part of their longer-term game plan. What is it that you're trying to accomplish with this? What they're trying to accomplish with this is frighteningly what they've actually managed to accomplish in northern Israel. As you and some of your readers probably know, there's been an onslaught of thousands of missiles per month that are being launched from southern Lebanon by Hezbollah into northern Israel. It essentially made life unlivable for the population living in the north of Israel. They've actually had to evacuate the entire area. So somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Israelis have had to abandon their homes and their businesses and their livelihood in northern Israel and simply leave the area. That is the future of Israel if they don't get a hold of this issue. Because the types of armaments that Hezbollah has right now are short-range missiles primarily. They have a lot of them. They have something like between 100 and 150,000. That's being drastically reduced right now. But before the conflict with Hezbollah, they were estimated to have somewhere between 100 and 150,000 projectiles, missiles of various sorts that they can launch into Israel. But they're
buying those from the Russians ultimately?
Yeah,
and the Chinese, or who do they get their missiles from?
Well, they're getting it from the Iranians, but the Iranians are getting their technology mainly from the Russians and a little bit from the Chinese.
Okay.
But they've also essentially with this technology, they've developed a sort of homegrown production. So Iran today, they're homegrown. They let's say acquired the technology, but they're bigger producers in terms of quantity of missiles and things like that right now than the Russians themselves. They just became, massive producers. And so they smuggle this stuff and get this stuff into the hands of their various proxies. Now, these missiles that, for example, Hezbollah had were relatively short range, and they had a relatively small number of guided missiles. But we know, and the Israelis know, that it's just a matter of time before Hezbollah was able to basically acquire the technology that would extend the range of their missiles and also make them accurate through, guided system, because this is technology that's pretty much available in the market right now. So it's only a matter of a few years before this barrage of thousands of missiles that right now are just hitting empty fields for the most part, and just every once in a while luckily hits a building or whatever, will be targeted directly, and they'll be able to hit whatever target they want. And when I say it's a matter of time, it's a matter of a couple of years at most before these proxy forces are able to really strike Israeli targets within Israel with great accuracy. And so what the Israelis understood, particularly in terms of what has happened in the north of Israel, is that if they don't defeat this strategy of the Iranians of having these proxy forces essentially do the dirty work for Iran and just launching missiles and various ground attacks, from the Israeli border, it will make life impossible for Israelis. And this is actually something that, again, has been said by leaders in Iran. Our goal is to make life impossible for Israelis and to get them to leave. And this is a long-term strategy till 2040. And the way that they would do this is essentially the way that Hezbollah has operated in the south of Lebanon and what they've done in northern Israel, which is basically get the whole population of northern Israel to evacuate. This has changed the thinking of Israelis, because this was probably just sounded like a little bit too abstract to the Israeli population that they were going to get wiped out by 2040. But a little bell and a little light bulb has lit up as a result of the effectiveness of this strategy, as has been demonstrated by what happened in northern Israel. Israelis right now have very much shifted to think this is an existential threat. This threat of getting rid of us by 2040, it could actually work. Look at what happened in northern Israel. Look at the fact that Hezbollah already has some weapon systems that were able to penetrate their defenses and hit targets in Haifa, which is, of course, one of the larger cities in Israel. They realize that time is working against them in terms of the acquisition of technology on the part of these. And so the thinking is, okay, we can't just go after these proxy forces because this is asymmetric warfare. We'd have to be invading neighboring nations and going after like
Well, it's
guerrilla folks.
whack-a-mole.
It would be
Right.
it would be
it's the whack-a-mole game that
yeah.
there's no way to chase it all down.
You can't chase it all down. So within Israel, there's developed this idea that there's the head of the octopus. Sometimes it's referred to as the head of the snake. The head of the octopus because there's all these different arms of Iran that are stationed in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, basically surrounding all of Israel, these various proxy forces, but that the head of this octopus that's got its arms sort of surrounding Israel is Iran. And that the only way to end this existential threat that these proxy forces pose is to go directly after the head of the octopus. And this is why various very high profile Israeli leaders in the last couple of months have been stepping up their talk within Israel that they have to go after the head of the octopus, that it's not going to do any good to just go after Hezbollah, because Hezbollah will eventually reconstitute itself with the financial, ideological, and military support of the Iranians. There's not going to be any shortage of folks there that they'll be able to get organized and to reconstitute Hezbollah. And they'll be back at square one 1 year from now, but with a better armed and more technologically sophisticated force in terms of Hezbollah 1 or 2 years from now. So they have to stop the flow of the armaments, the flow of the financing, the ideological flow. That means that they have to go after Iran. And so the Israeli people, let's say there's been a shift where more and more Israeli people believe that they have to confront Iran directly and that they have to do it now because they believe that in 1 or 2 years' time, it may be too late.
Interesting. So looking into the crystal ball, we have the Trump administration coming on. At least the stated policy there is let's starve the Iranian regime, not let them sell oil, penalties on China if China buys it, etc. Given that lens, walk me through the crystal ball of how you see this playing out. And if you want to say 2 or 3 different scenarios, great. But
sure. I mean, this is tough because we're in a very weird position right now, because of the transition from the Biden to the Trump administration. So the major players in this conflict are caught in this kind of a gray middle, and they're sort of wondering what they need to do.
Mom, Dad said this, Dad, Mom said that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Iranians are having to revisit their strategy in terms of retaliation for the latest round of Israeli attacks. The Israelis are also have to sort of rethink their tactics in terms of what they're going to do and what they're going to be able to do as a result of the new administration. So let's kind of review some factors that are going to be relevant for this. First of all, I think the single most important thing to note here, and something that I don't think the people are paying enough attention to, is that Trump couldn't have selected a more hawkish cabinet regarding Iran. It's extraordinary how hawkish his foreign policy and his defense team are towards Iran. So whether we're talking about the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's been a major Iran hawk for a very long time, the ambassador to Israel, Huckabee, who's a guy who doesn't even believe in that there is such a thing as Palestine, and he's actually publicly stated this, that there's no such thing as Palestinians, that he believes that Israel should annex the West Bank and Gaza to form part of the biblical Israel, and he's been vocal about this. Of course, he's just going to be the ambassador. He's not going to make those policies happen, but people know where he stands on this issue. Trump knows where he stands, and he's put him in this position, right? Pete Hegseth has said some extremely hawkish things about Iran. The current the guy who's the nominee for Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, for example, when Trump went after Soleimani, he thought it wasn't enough, that the U.S. should have actually bombed the Iranians and gone after their nuclear and their oil facilities. So he's extremely hawkish. The entire team, the CIA director, a guy who has said that you can't really negotiate with Iran. The only thing that you can do with them is sort of put your foot on their neck, is the term that he used in terms of dealing with them. So with that background, and we also have the background of Trump having publicly stated during the campaign, as you recall, that he was shocked at the Biden administration for trying to restrain Israel from going after Iran's nuclear facilities. He said, that's exactly the wrong approach. The Israelis need to go directly after the nuclear facilities because this is actually the biggest threat. So take care of that first and then worry about the rest later.
Two things I'll say about Trump, and whether you like him, dislike him, setting that aside, he truly seems to be frightened by nuclear war. I think he, rare among politicians, actually understands the gravitas of it, and it's kind of been that way his whole life. I mean, he's always that. The other thing I find interesting about Trump is he has always been an anti-war guy. I mean, I don't know if you describe it. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as an isolationist, because he'll go bomb ISIS into oblivion and stuff like that. But at the same time, he's always been very measured in terms of committing U.S. troops and going to war. So it's interesting to throw that into the stew you just laid out.
Absolutely. And I think that's it's a huge tension there. And it's a huge tension within sort of MAGA, because MAGA would rather not see the U.S. get involved, for example, with Iran. A lot of MAGA, there's at least a wing within MAGA that's very, I'll charitably put it as being skeptical towards Israel. And they don't want for the United States to be dragged into a war by Israel, in a war that, some people believe that, the United States has no interest in. But I think what Trump has signaled goes to what you're saying. He has said consistently that Iran cannot be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon. And in fact, he recently gave a speech just a couple weeks before the end of the campaign. He says that, I like the Iranian people. And, we have he even said, we don't have any interest in regime change there. The Iranian people are going to determine their destiny. But the one thing, and we want to have trade with them, we want them to be prosperous. But the one thing that we will not allow is for them to have a nuclear weapon. Because I do think that Trump is legitimately scared that if they acquire one, they'll actually use it. Because he thinks, rightly or wrongly, that they're crazy enough that they might actually use it. And so he's already publicly stated that he believes that the right policy from the point of view of the Israelis is to actually go after their nuclear facilities. I mean, it couldn't be more clear than that. That implicitly means that he will have Israel's back if Israel actually goes that route. What does that mean? That actually means war. The United States will actually be at that point dragged into a war between Israel and Iran, which is something that Trump doesn't want from many points of view. And not the least of
Israel can't, they'd have to use our bunker buster bombs, right, to go after the nuclear stuff.
Yeah.
And Israel can't drop those. It would be U.S. ships, right? Is that the way the technology works?
Well, Israel will definitely need U.S. support, both in terms of its offensive operations, but even more important, defensively, because, the Iranians are going to unleash a massive barrage of missiles into Israel, that much more dangerous than the sort of the show that they've been putting out to this point. What they meant to do there was just to sort of, scare people and show their capacities a little bit. But the Iranians have the capacity to send 3 times or more in terms of the amount of missiles at any specific point in time, and could actually overwhelm the Israeli defenses. So Israel is very much going to count on U.S. protection in terms of defensive measures. Now, the other thing that I think is going to happen, interestingly, is that to the extent that Trump is going to support Israel in a war scenario, if a war scenario happens, and by the way, I'm not saying that, I'm going to actually kind of go over a little bit the potential peace scenario, right? Okay. But just talking about the war scenario, if a war breaks out, it's going to be in Trump's interest to get this war over with as soon as possible. Because as I said, the first thing that's going to happen is global oil prices are going to shoot up, and the Iranians are probably going to try to block the Strait of Hormuz. That could literally destroy the Trump presidency if oil prices, go up, inflation. I mean, it'll destroy any presidency, but maybe even more so in his case, because he's been promising lower oil prices and so forth. And so the last thing he wants is a war, and the last thing he wants is a war in the Middle East, and even less does he want a war that's going to cause oil prices to rise. Therefore, if it really comes down to it, and the Israelis end up attacking Iran's nuclear facilities, that'll trigger an all-out war between Iran and Israel. What Trump wants to do is to intervene so forcefully, probably with overwhelming force, that it gets the war done quicker. And that's the irony of this, right? Trump doesn't want war, but if there's going to be war, I think that he may opt for the application of overwhelming force to try to get it done quickly. And so there's a little bit of a contradiction there, but I think that that's sort of where things are heading if in fact we end up in a situation with a war. Now, I think that he's going to try to do whatever he can to try to prevent that war. And what do I mean by that? Whatever he can. I think that Trump, he has a good relationship with Netanyahu, and also a lot of, let's say, people in Israeli government that are close to their policymaking circles there. And they've basically told Trump, says, look, this is existential for us. If we have to go it alone, we will go alone. We're not going to allow them to acquire a nuclear weapon. They're going to be telling him things like, which a lot by people in the U.S. believe this as well, that in the long run, you really can't prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Sooner or later, just like North Korea did and Pakistan did, they will end up developing it clandestinely. It's just a matter of time. So for the Israelis, it's existential for them that they not be allowed, and that they not be allowed to implement this 2040 strategy. And they've said, we're going to stop this regardless. And at that point, any U.S. administration, not just Trump, Biden would have been forced to as well, or Kamala Harris if she'd been elected, is that if Israel goes to war with Iran, the U.S. will be put in the position as, are we going to back them or not? And I think that in the end, there's a lot of reasons to suppose that the U.S. will end up coming in and backing Israel. And I think that Trump has given all the signals to the Israelis that if it comes down to it, he will back them in a war. So the question really is right now, can it even be prevented at this point? Because the Israelis have already decided that from a strategic point of view, they must get rid of Iran's nuclear capabilities within the next year or two. Because within the next year or two, they could literally come up with a nuclear weapon. And at that point, game over for Israel in terms of their overall strategic vision of trying to protect themselves against the 2040 strategy. Because at that point, to be clear, Israel will never be able to go after the head of the octopus, right? At that point, the head of the octopus will be able to continue to finance and arm all of Israel's proxies, and Israel will be forced into only fighting against these proxies and will never be able to actually go after Iran itself, which is actually behind all this, because Iran will be protected by the nuclear umbrella and the nuclear deterrent of possessing a nuclear weapon. So in order to prevent this strategy, which is a non-nuclear strategy, by the way, that's the other thing that people have a misconception. Iran's strategy is not to launch a nuclear bomb on Israel and destroy Israel with nuclear weapons. Why? Because that would actually be suicidal. The Israelis have a lot of nuclear weapons themselves. So if they launched any kind of a nuclear weapon at Israel, it would just be mutually assured destruction. The Israelis would destroy all of Iran. That's not what the Iranians are aiming for. The Iranians, what they want is they want to have impunity to finance conventional asymmetric warfare by their proxies in a way that the Israelis can't go after the Iranians, because they would be in this position of mutually assured destruction. So anyway, I just went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but back.
But I mean, if the Iranians do have a nuclear bomb, if we just want people to move, that's another arrow in the quiver.
Sure.
So
exactly. So, and they are pursuing, and the belief is in policymaking circles, both in the U.S. intelligence community and in Israel, that the Iranians are getting close, and they're getting dangerously close. It's just a matter of time, possibly a matter of a year or two, probably more like a year before if they actually decide to go forward full force, they can acquire that nuclear weapon. So the Israelis say, hey, the clock is ticking in terms of our ability to get at their nuclear program. the clock is also ticking in terms of the development of these other missile technologies that the Iranians have been developing and that have been distributing them to their proxies, such as the Houthis. The Houthis of Yemen actually already have hypersonic missiles. I mean, so this is this is an existential threat. And I think what the Israelis have told the Americans, and specifically Trump, they've said, we need to stop the Iranians from developing nuclear missiles, and we need to try to affect regime change, because that's the other thing there. It's like, we can't just defeat them militarily and allow the same regime to stay in place, because they'll just be coming after us even harder, 2 years later. Part of their strategy is to actually try to, get regime change done. And they've informed the Americans about this, and the United States is essentially going to have to decide whether they're going to be with Israel and they're going to back them in an eventual war or not. Now, the possibility is that, well, what if this can be done diplomatically? And I think that Trump is going to try to go all out on this regard. He's going to implement this policy of maximum pressure, but it's going to even be much more intense than what happened.
I will say this too, again, not to whether you like Trump or not, put it aside. This is one of the things I don't like about Trump is I think he bluffs and goes with maximum pressure and stuff way more than I would feel comfortable. I mean, the word is that he told Putin, I'm going to, take that palace you sleep in and bomb the hell out of it. And the two women on both sides of you are going to realize missiles are a lot bigger than your dick. I mean, that is supposedly what he said to Putin. And to me, I mean, I don't say that to somebody that has nuclear weapons.
Sure.
But, that is the way he operates.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what he's going to try to do. He's going to try to scare the Iranians into a nuclear deal where essentially Iran agrees to disarm itself in terms of their nuclear capability, probably in exchange for other things where Trump will say, hey, we'll do business with you. We'll buy your oil from you guys, but the one thing that you can't have is a nuclear missile. And you also, have to do a couple other things. I think that's the fact that he selected the cabinet that he did in terms of his foreign policy and defense team shows that he's coming in with a huge stick. That's a direct threat to Iran saying, we're coming after you guys. Like, if you guys don't play ball with us, we're going after you militarily in holding, in lockstep with the Israelis, because Trump, again, has already signaled his very firm support for Israel, and that he actually supports them if the Israelis actually decided to attack the nuclear facilities. So I think that Trump, his play over the next few months, during the transition and also during the first few months of the administration, is he's going to try to see what can get done diplomatically. And he's going to tell the Israelis, look, I'm behind you guys 100%, but Trump is a little bit arrogant. He said, let me see if I can get a deal done.
Right.
Let's see if I can get a deal done by bluffing, by, showing strength. Let's see if we can get a deal done with the Iranians where you guys get everything that you guys want in terms of your security. We're going to get them to stop the flow of arms and stop their support of proxies in the region, which is what you want. And we're going to get them to give up their nuclear program. And if I can't get that done in X amount of time, then I'm going to be behind you in going after the Iranians. I think that that's my interpretation of where we stand right now, that the Israelis are feeling very confident that they have Trump in their corner, and they're going to give him the benefit of doubt. They're going to say, okay, we're not going to actually start this war right off. We're going to give Trump a chance to see if he can get this done diplomatically. I think the thought is that it's not going to happen. The Iranians aren't going to roll over that way. They're too proud. And they've already invested too much in, for example, their relations with all these proxies and so forth. And it's sort of, again, part of the ideology of the IRGC. I don't even if the Iranian leadership wanted to stop support for their proxies, the military wouldn't even allow them to do it at this point. Yeah. But again, I think the Israelis are going to try to give Trump an opportunity. And so that's why we're going to have a little bit of a lull here probably over the next few months, where the Iranians are going to stay put. They're going to be like, okay, we know that if we attack the Israelis are coming after us with everything, and they're going to have full U.S. support behind them. So it's not in their interest to provoke a major war right now. And at the same time, Trump is going to come in. He's going to try to, there's going to be some sort of diplomatic overture. So nobody's going to start a war when there's, sort of diplomatic negotiations going on. And there's this effort on the part of Trump to try to, get a deal done. But ultimately, I think when you look at the larger picture, the Israelis have decided that getting rid of Iran's nuclear capabilities, getting rid of their financing of these proxy groups is absolutely existential to the state of Israel. Israel will not exist a few years from now if they continue to allow Iran to finance these proxies in the region. So it's existential. And they're saying, and the clock is ticking against them. They have to do this now. They can't wait for 2 or 3 years and diplomacy to play itself out, or wait for maybe regime change in Iran, God knows when. They've decided we can't do that. We have to provoke a confrontation with Iran now, while we still possess the strategic upper hand. We have nuclear weapons. We have more sophisticated weaponry. We have the support of a U.S. administration. Right now, if there's going to be a war with Iran, we need to have it now and not 3 years from now.
So last question, because I could talk this all day, but does Ukraine play into this? I mean, it would seem to me that Putin's at least got to be consulted on the Iranian-Israeli issue. And it's really bizarre to me. I grew up in life where, we sat and we talked to the Russians or the Soviets all the time.
Yeah.
They were our mortal enemy. I mean, Cold War, all that, but we talked to them all the time. There were, Nixon went to China, Reagan sat down with Gorbachev, et cetera. Now it seems like you're a Putin sympathizer if you talk to Putin, but I do think we're going to have to talk to Putin about the Iranian-Israeli issue, because doesn't he have a lot of influence on Iran?
Absolutely. He's been trying to position himself for years to be influential. And there's been the Putin, through his intelligence services, have been instrumental in getting sophisticated weaponry to some of these proxy groups like the Houthis. They couldn't have done this without the Russian help. And obviously the Iranians have been arming themselves with Russian help. The Russians see their relationship with Iran as their means of gaining influence in the Middle East and being a major power broker. So you're right that Putin plays a role here. And so indirectly, the issues in Ukraine, become indirectly important. I think it's impossible to kind of predict exactly how the Ukraine situation factors in here, but I agree that it factors in. So one way that, for example, it could factor in is that one of the thoughts might be is that Trump might see as part of a package deal. Let's say he tells the Russians, he says, "Okay, guys, we're going to kind of give you a fair bit in your negotiations with Ukraine in terms of taking swaths of territory and so forth, but we need you guys to completely lay off the Iranians and let us handle that. And you need this little alliance that you've been building up with Iran. We need you to completely back off there, because we need to isolate the Iranians and get them to bow their knee and to get rid of their, because the Iranians feel emboldened. As long as they have this flow of technology and missiles flowing in, they feel that they can sort of defend themselves. But if they feel that Russia no longer has their back, they're going to be more likely to cave. So I think that Trump probably sees the possibility of an arrangement in Ukraine is also catalyzing a more favorable position with respect to Iran. I think that's one of the things that may play out, and something that they're probably thinking. But the opposite is also true. There are a lot of voices, and they've actually been coming out this week within Trump's team that are actually quite hostile to Putin, and that are sort of supporters of Ukraine. He brought in a lot of folks in his foreign policy team that have been supporting Ukraine. And in fact, Seb Gorka, who's one of the advisors he just hired, said that what Trump is going to do is that he's going to increase military support for Ukraine fivefold. Again, as a means of bluffing Putin and getting Putin to sit to the table and have a reasonable deal. It basically, under this theory, Trump believes that if he comes in with guns blazing and sort of, come in with a very strong kind of position that he can force Putin into an acceptable deal that, that can be acceptable to sort of all parties, or at least it won't be a complete cave-in to the Russians in terms of their territorial claims and so forth. So that's the other side of this, because if Trump is not able to get a deal done in Ukraine and this war continues and U.S. continues to provide support for the Ukrainians, and basically the U.S. is involved in a kind of proxy war against Russia, Putin is going to say, okay, you want to have your proxy war against us in Ukraine? We're going to have our proxy war, and we're going to arm our proxy,
younger brother,
which is Iran,
right?
And we're going to support them. And you can't do nothing because if you're arming the Ukrainians, we can arm the Iranians, and they will, and that's a very, let's say, powerful card, because if they just provide the Iranians with a little bit more technology in terms of hypersonic missiles, they don't need nuclear. They don't need nuclear. I mean, the hypersonic missiles by themselves are enough to really wipe out like a lot of Israel, and certainly their major cities, military infrastructure, and so forth, because there's really no defense against it. And so the Iranians already possess hypersonic missile technology. Obviously, the Russians have even more sophisticated stuff that notch it up a little bit more, and it would completely change the balance of power, therefore, in the conflict there between Israel and Iran. And that's a card that the Russians hold. Say, hey, we can completely change the balance of power there if you don't play ball with us over here. So I do think that you're right that what's going on in Ukraine will indirectly impact what's happening in this conflict between Iran and Israel. And I actually think it's very unpredictable. I think it could go either way. In other words, a lot of people that were expecting Trump to come in and just cave to Putin, apparently that's not in the cards. That's apparently not what's going to be happening. There's going to be at least some initial, let's say, confrontation and show of strength. And there's going to be some very, very difficult, strained negotiation relationship probably there, or at least there's a potential for that. And that could very much affect kind of the whole calculus that we've been talking about here in terms of both the timing and the sequencing events. Because one of the things that we have to understand is that the sequencing of events is very important. For example, the Israelis need a pretext to be able to attack the Iranians. They won't have the support of the United States, and certainly they won't have support of the international community if they just sort of are seen as an aggressor that unilaterally is going to go after Iran and initiate a major war. The Israelis want to be able to initiate their attack under the cover of some prior action on the part of the Iranians that justifies sort of them initiating an all-out war. So the sequencing is very important, because as long as the Iranians sort of stay pat, they can kind of, the Israelis will kind of have their hands tied, so to speak, and the Americans will have their hands tied, so to speak. But again, in terms of sequencing, if the Israelis get wind of the fact that they're starting to receive more sophisticated weaponry and technology from the Russians that will actually endanger them, the Israelis will definitely have to start considering preemptive action at that point. Because they can't just allow the Iranians to acquire this strategic technology that'll literally change the balance of power. Because remember, the whole idea is that Israel wants to have this war with Iran while they still have a strategic advantage. That strategic advantage could vanish like this if Putin provides certain types of support. In that scenario, what the Israelis need to do is to preemptively attack. So there's a lot of moving sort of parts and pictures here. And again, the interesting thing is that the markets in general, equity markets, but in the industry that we're discussing here, the energy markets are really just completely asleep on all of this.
Yeah.
It's not a subject of conversation very much. It's almost sort of business as usual. Yeah, there's stuff in the Middle East, but there's always stuff going on in the Middle East, right? There's always like the potential for threat. And, usually when people get all excited about that, nothing happens. It's all the same thing. They'll work it out. That's the attitude. But I think right now, what people don't understand is that things have changed, and there's existential issues at stake here for the Israelis that have changed the whole way that they look at the threat from Iran. And I think, again, this has been a blind spot. People don't understand the shift within Israeli strategic mentality that has basically forced the Israelis to approach this in a completely different way.
So I always hated it whenever a management team walked in and would say, this time it's different. Mm-hmm. I think you just walked in and said, this time it's different, but I believe.
Yeah, I do think this time is different.
How do people get in touch with you?
InvestorAcumen.com is probably the most direct way to get in touch with me. I also have a service on seekingalpha.com that's called Successful Portfolio Strategy. And it's and I have a different service that I just offer on investor.com, which is called the Crisis Opportunity Portfolio, which is a very specific portfolio that I'm designing around the possibility of this sort of major conflict between Iran and Israel. So it's a kind of a niche, let's say, portfolio. It's a niche opportunity, but also one that has a lot of, potential upside.
Awesome. Appreciate you coming on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Anything we didn't touch on that we should have? I mean, we could have rabbit holed kind of all day because we didn't even bring in North Korea into this. And that dude's a weird cat. And China,
one of the things I talked about some of the, I don't think this is necessary, but you can tell me, changes within Israel. There's a lot of demographic and political changes in Israel that I think are a big blind spot that are also pushing this change in policy. And so if you want, I could talk a little bit about that, about the fact that the Israeli population is experiencing a major sort of demographic shift towards a much more conservative, hawkish, and sort of aggressive policy towards their Middle Eastern neighbors. And that's something that, it's kind of interesting, but I don't know. Right. It's a little bit getting into an offshoot. But again, I think it's a little bit of a blind spot because we're used to the Israeli leadership that Americans have been used to for, 50 years. And the same type of, let's say, outlook in terms of their leadership that reflected the population there, which is basically Ashkenazi descendants of Western Europeans, Eastern Europeans, sort of intellectuals. Today, the Israeli population is really shifting in terms of their outlook, and that shift in outlook means a completely different outlook in terms of how they see their relationships with Arab countries. And it's much less friendly, much less diplomatic, much less hesitant to use force.
And just my anecdotal experience with Jewish friends that are much more knowledgeable than I am about all this. October 7th mattered.
Sure.
It was a game changer.
Sure.
It was 9/11 like in kind of its ability to,
It was a red pill type of a moment.
Totally.
And so it's sort of interesting because, again, these demographic changes have been very gradual, but then there's this singular event, October 7th. Right. And then in the aftermath of October 7th, what happened in northern Israel with the fact that they've had to evacuate the entire population in northern Israel. This has completely changed the way the Israeli population is thinking. And so if you couple this along with these very clear demographic trends where the younger Israeli population is much more, let's say, militarily aggressive and, let's say, anti-Islamic, anti-Arab, willing to confront the Arabs directly, that makes for a different Israeli politics, and this factors into the possibility or greater probability of a war, because a war was something that maybe 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, was something that the Israeli, let's say, the center of Israeli politics would have wanted to avoid at all costs. I mean, to the point where they even allow the Iranians to acquire a nuclear weapon. That's no longer the case. Yeah. The new generation of Israelis they're like, no way in hell will we ever allow the Iranians to acquire a nuclear weapon.
I've got, she's a friend of a friend more so than, but by the transitive property, I consider her a good friend. Her Her parents went and volunteered for the military.
Mhm.
And I would have said they were kind of left of center on the politics scale. And October 7th said, I mean, they're in their 70s, so they were doing logistics type stuff. They weren't picking up a weapon, but they might have.
Sure.
If they needed to.
This has galvanized the population, or a huge portion of the population. And it's shifted the consensus in terms of consensus thinking about how Israel has to deal with its relationship with its neighbors, how it has to deal with Iran. It's a real sea change. And again, I think this is a blind spot for Americans because we don't actually know or understand that there's this like sea change going on in Israeli politics, but that sea change is going to be the one that could actually trigger the war. And that war is one that Americans will ultimately end up participating in, one way or another.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me.